For decades, Carlos Santana kept it hidden. The pain, the betrayal, the moments when he begged for the suffering to stop.
He has sold over 100 million records. He has 10 Grammy Awards sitting on a shelf somewhere in Las Vegas. He turned a single afternoon at Woodstock into 50 years of legend. And yet, for most of his life, Carlos Santana was carrying something behind that famous half-smile that almost none of his fans knew about. Not the drugs, not the music, something darker. A wound from childhood he didn't speak about for decades, and a night in his 50s when he says he came closer to ending his own life than anyone around him ever realized. This is the real story of Carlos Santana, told the way he has finally chosen to tell it himself. Carlos Humberto Santana Barragán was born on July 20th, 1947, in the small town of Autlan de Navarro, in the Mexican state of Jalisco. His father, Jose, was a professional mariachi violinist, the kind of musician who could walk into a room and command it with a single note. Carlos grew up watching his father play, watching the way music made people stop what they were doing and listen, watching the way it made women look at his father with something close to adoration. He has said that watching his father was the first time he understood what music could actually do to another human being, and that he wanted that feeling for himself before he even understood what wanting it meant. When Carlos was still a boy, his family relocated to Tijuana on the Mexican side of the border with California. It was a rougher, faster world than the one he'd known in Jalisco, and it changed the direction of his life almost immediately. Wandering through a park one day, he heard a rock and roll band playing, a group of teenagers doing their best impression of the American sound coming across the border on the radio. Something about the electric guitar, the volume, the sheer audacity of it, hooked him in a way that mariachi music never had. From that point on, Carlos wanted to be a rock guitarist, not a violinist like his father. But Tijuana in those years wasn't kind to him. In interviews and in his own 2014 memoir, The Universal Tone, Santana has spoken publicly about being sexually abused as a child by an adult acquaintance of the family, a man who took advantage of his access and his position of trust to hurt a boy who had no way to protect himself. Santana has said that the abuse left him carrying shame and confusion that he didn't have the language for at the time, and that it took him decades, real decades, to even begin to process what had happened to him. He didn't talk about it publicly until the year 2000, and he didn't write about it at length until his memoir came out 14 years after that. It's one of the most quietly devastating threads in his entire story, because while the rest of the world was watching a rising guitar prodigy, Carlos was carrying a private injury that nobody around him seemed to notice. By his early teens, Carlos was already playing professionally, taking guitar gigs in the bars and clubs of Tijuana's nightlife district, some of them rough, adult spaces that no child should have had to work in. He's described those years candidly, saying they were where he learned to hold a room, to read a crowd, to play with confidence even when he was terrified underneath it. It was an unconventional education, forged in the kind of environment most musicians never have to survive, let alone as children. Eventually, the family moved north to San Francisco, chasing better opportunity in the United States. Carlos was a teenager in a new country, with a new language to learn and almost no money. He worked as a dishwasher to help support the family, and in his off hours he played guitar on the streets of San Francisco, busking outside cafes and tourist spots for whatever coin strangers were willing to drop into his case. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival. But it was also an education in its own right, because standing on those street corners, Carlos absorbed everything. The jazz drifting out of nearby clubs, the blues records his friends played, the folk revival happening all around him in the Bay Area. He began fusing all of it together, blues guitar, phrasing laid over Latin rhythm, long before anyone had a name for what he was doing. In 1966, that fusion found a home. Carlos formed a group originally called the Santana Blues Band, built around musicians he met through the Bay Area scene, including keyboardist Greg Rowley and percussionist Michael Carabello, the man who is credited with suggesting they simply call the group Santana, since it was short, memorable, and already tied to Carlos's growing local reputation. The band started building a following in San Francisco's ballrooms, the same rooms where Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead were making their names. It was the city's most important promoter, Bill Graham, who changed everything for them. Graham believed in Santana before almost anyone outside San Francisco had heard of them. And when he was helping put together the lineup for a massive outdoor festival in upstate New York in the summer of 1969, he made sure Santana got a slot. This was a genuinely bold move on Graham's part. Santana hadn't even released their first album yet. Most of the hundreds of thousands of people who would eventually pack into that field in Bethel, New York, had absolutely no idea who they were. What happened next has become one of the most famous and most surreal stories in rock history. Santana arrived at Woodstock expecting to perform well after midnight, giving Carlos, then just 22 years old, what he thought was a comfortable window of time. Backstage, Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, offered him something to take the edge off the weight, most likely mescaline. Santana has told this story many times over the years, and the details are consistent. Shortly after taking it, he was informed that the schedule had changed and Santana needed to go on stage immediately, hours earlier than expected, right as the drug was taking full effect. What followed was, by his own description, one of the strangest performances any musician has ever had to survive. Santana has said that once he was on stage, the neck of his own guitar appeared to him as a living, writhing snake, twisting in his hands as he tried to play. He's compared the sensation to a surfer wrestling to keep his balance, fighting not against the crowd or the moment, but against his own mind. He kept his eyes closed through much of the set, trusting muscle memory to find the right notes, because he genuinely wasn't sure his vision could be trusted. At one point, by his own account, he silently asked God for one simple thing: to help him stay in tune and stay in time, nothing more. Whatever was happening internally, the outside world saw something else entirely. A mesmerizing, ferocious set built around the song Soul Sacrifice, anchored by a thunderous drum solo from teenage drummer Michael Shreve, that is now remembered as one of the defining performances of the entire festival. 2 weeks after Woodstock, Santana's self-titled debut album hit shelves. The timing could not have been better. A band that had been playing bars in Tijuana and busking on street corners just a few years earlier was suddenly a national sensation. The album stayed on the charts for over 2 years. The single Evil Ways became their breakthrough hit. Bill Graham continued opening doors, helping land the band a spot on The Ed Sullivan Show that same year. With his first real royalty check, Carlos kept a promise he'd made to himself. He bought his mother a house. In 1973, Carlos married Deborah King, the daughter of blues musician Saunders King. It became far more than a marriage. It became a genuine business partnership. Deborah eventually took on formal roles managing Santana's career and finances, and by his own admission years later, there were stretches, particularly through the 1990s, where he might have ended up with nothing without her steering the business side of his career. Together, they had 3 children. Salvador, who grew up to become a musician in his own right and would eventually join his father's band. Stella, a singer-songwriter, and Angelica, a writer and film producer. In 1998, Carlos and Deborah founded the Milagro Foundation, a charity focused on supporting underprivileged children around the world. Then, in 1999, at the age of 52, Carlos Santana pulled off one of the most improbable comebacks in the history of popular music. He hadn't landed a top 10 single since the early 1970s. But Clive Davis, the same executive who had signed Santana to Columbia Records decades earlier, approached him with an idea: build an album around collaborations with a new generation of artists. The result was supernatural, and it became a genuine cultural phenomenon, eventually selling around 30 million copies worldwide. One of the songs almost didn't make the cut. It started as a rougher demo, and Santana himself was initially lukewarm on it. It took a personal push from Clive Davis and the involvement of singer-songwriter Rob Thomas to turn it into Smooth, a song that would go on to spend 12 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and become one of the defining singles of its era. At the 2000 Grammy Awards, Santana won 9 awards in a single night, tying a record for the most Grammys won by an artist in one ceremony. And he became the first Hispanic artist ever to win Album of the Year. By every outward measure, Carlos Santana was living a triumphant second act. But behind the scenes, his marriage was quietly falling apart. In 2005, Deborah published her own memoir, Space Between the Stars, in which she spoke candidly about infidelity within their marriage. 2 years later, in 2007, she filed for divorce after 34 years together, citing irreconcilable differences. Carlos later spoke publicly about the end of the marriage, taking responsibility for his own actions, saying he had sincerely apologized to Deborah and to their children for hurting them during a period when, in his words, he wasn't in the right frame of mind. What Santana revealed later, in a 2008 interview with Rolling Stone, was far more serious than most fans realized at the time. He said that the collapse of his marriage triggered the darkest period of his entire life, one in which he attempted to take his own life 7 separate times. He described reaching a point where he genuinely believed death would bring more peace than continuing to live with that level of pain. What he says pulled him back every single time was his faith. He has described hearing what felt like a calm, steady voice reassuring him that he wasn't alone, and finding comfort in prayer and in his growing Christian faith during that period. He has also said that the emotional collapse of his marriage reopened the old wound from his childhood, the abuse he had suffered as a boy in Tijuana, and that working through both of those things at once, the divorce and the resurfaced trauma, forced him into a reckoning he had been avoiding for most of his adult life. He has spoken about eventually reaching a place of forgiveness toward the man who abused him, describing the forgiveness not as something he did for his abuser, but as something he ultimately did to free himself. Santana's spiritual path had already been a long and winding one by that point. In the 1970s, he became a devoted follower of the Indian spiritual teacher Sri Chinmoy, who gave him the name Devadip, meaning roughly the lamp, light, and eye of God. Santana walked away from Chinmoy's guidance in 1982 over disagreements about how much control the guru expected over his personal life. In the years that followed, and especially after the pain of his divorce, Santana leaned into Christianity, and by the mid-2010s, he was speaking openly about wanting to become a minister someday, and even talked about opening a church of his own. Life didn't stop handing him new chapters. In 2010, Carlos married his longtime drummer, Cindy Blackman, proposing to her on one knee during a concert outside Chicago. Blackman had already built her own serious career as a jazz and rock drummer, having toured with artists like Lenny Kravitz before joining Santana's band. Their marriage brought his personal life and his musical life together under one roof, and Cindy became a fixture of his live shows, frequently drawing her own spotlight moments with drum solos during the encore. More recently, Santana's story has taken on new layers, some inspiring, some genuinely controversial. In the summer of 2023, during a concert in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Santana paused a set to deliver an unscripted, several-minute speech about gender, telling the crowd that a person's identity was fixed before birth, and using the phrase "a woman is a woman and a man is a man." He also expressed solidarity with comedian Dave Chappelle, who had faced his own backlash over comments about transgender people in a Netflix special. Video of the speech went viral days later, and the reaction was swift. LGBTQ advocacy organizations, including groups based in his own longtime home of San Francisco, publicly criticized the remarks, especially given the political climate around transgender rights in the United States at that time. Santana posted an apology on Facebook, saying his comments didn't reflect his desire to honor and respect all people's beliefs, and that he was sorry for the hurt he caused. He later took that apology down and replaced it with a shorter, more cryptic message about energy and love, which only added to the public confusion and criticism. It remains one of the more polarizing moments of his later career, a reminder that even a musician whose entire artistic identity is built around fusion, blending cultures, genres, and sounds that supposedly didn't belong together, isn't immune to dividing the very audience he spent decades bringing together. Physically, Santana has also had to confront the realities of aging in public. In September 2024, he was forced to cancel a string of concert dates, including shows in Albuquerque and Phoenix, and to postpone part of his long-running Las Vegas residency after needing urgent surgery related to a back problem. He had already been performing several shows seated in the months before that. Despite the setback, he returned to the stage later that same month, including a show at the Kia Forum, where he performed songs from Supernatural to mark the album's 25th anniversary, proving once again that he wasn't ready to slow down simply because his body was asking him to. Today, Carlos Santana's band is a genuine family affair. His wife, Cindy Blackman Santana, anchors the rhythm section from behind the drum kit. His son, Salvador, from his first marriage, plays keyboards and percussion and even contributes vocals on stage. Their live shows still pull from a deep well of both classic hits and newer material, built around the same fusion of blues, rock, jazz, and Latin rhythm that Carlos started chasing as a teenager listening to a garage band in a Tijuana park. At 77 years old, Santana talks about life now through a framework he sums up in 4 words: diet, devotion, dedication, and discipline. He said publicly that eating well means nothing if your thinking isn't right, that physical strength and mental and spiritual health are inseparable from each other. He's described a mystical experience he had involving the Virgin of Guadalupe that he says permanently changed the way he sees his own purpose, and he now regularly asks the people around him what he calls a simple but enormous question: what is God saying to you right now? His message to audiences has increasingly become less about the guitar and more about resilience itself, urging people to hold on to their own inner light, even when life is doing everything it can put out. What makes Carlos Santana's story so striking isn't just the music, although the music alone would be enough to fill several documentaries. It's the distance between the image the world had of him for most of his career, the serene, spiritual guitar legend who seemed untouchable, and the far more complicated reality he has only recently allowed people to see. A boy who was abused and told no one for decades. A dishwasher who slept without a proper bed and buskied for spare change. A 22-year-old who played one of the most iconic sets in rock history while hallucinating that his own guitar was a snake. A husband whose marriage collapsed publicly and privately at the same time. A man who has said, in his own words, that he came within a breath of ending his life 7 times, and who found his way back through faith, forgiveness, and an almost stubborn refusal to let his story end there. Carlos Santana didn't just survive all of that. He turned it into some of the most enduring music of the last 60 years. And at 77, still walking on stage several nights a week, he's still not done telling his story.